Please welcome Laurie Manwell.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Okay. And thank you to Judge Impozumoto and Professors Lee, Johnson, and Jenkins for taking the time to be present here with us for these proceedings. I'm honored and really quite humbled that I'm able to speak before all of you today, and that I'm speaking alongside Professors Griffin, Scott, and Senator Gravel. Of war and humanity and the utter madness of militarism, Dr. Martin Luther King had this to say more than 40 years ago about his responsibility to challenge his own government regarding its war on Vietnam. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in a time of war. And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. I'm here to speak to you about the betrayal of truth that still continues today and to break the silence about events that present a profound challenge to our most closely guarded beliefs about government and democracy. The public's attention must be brought to bear upon the state crimes against democracy related to the events of September 11th, 2001. And the perpetrators and profiteers must be prosecuted for their crimes against humanity, crimes that have affected people worldwide, a decade past and continuing onward with no foreseeable end. These events collectively are referred to as state crimes against democracy, or SCADs, as Professor DeHaven-Smith has labeled them and discussed with us at length during our first presentation at these hearings. State crimes against democracy are actions which are undertaken in direct violation of sworn oaths of office by officials in order to circumvent, exploit, undermine, or subvert laws, the constitutional order, or the public awareness essential to popular control of government. SCADs are dangerous to democracy because they are not isolated events, but a pattern of actions, or in some cases, inactions, which facilitate a progression towards closing down an open and free society into a police state run by a select few. The work I will be presenting is based on an international collaboration with 5 other academics, Drs. DeHaven-Smith, Witt, and Hinson in the United States, and Dr. Thorne and the late Dr. Kuzman in Australia. My paper is one of the 6 journal articles published in the special issue of American Behavioral Scientists on State Crimes Against Democracy, and it focuses specifically on scientific studies of attitudes, of biases, and faulty beliefs that can prevent people from processing information that challenges pre-existing assumptions about government, reasoned dissent, public discourse in a democratic society. Now, all of the information I present is based on widely accepted scientific research. Some of the concepts and explanations are quite complex and replete with technical jargon, so I will do my best to simplify things where appropriate, but there will be some times when important distinctions between concepts require more technical terminology. Although there are many theories as to why some people refuse to look at evidence that the official account is false, they're not all equally valid theories. It is neither valid nor accurate to claim that just because a person will not examine evidence that the official account is false, that they are simply in denial. The human brain is the most complex organism in the body, and thus the mechanisms by which the mind processes, interprets, and responds to information is equally complex. For example, the human brain is composed of hundreds of billions of neurons, each with thousands of synapses, creating a vastly complex and intricate neural network consisting of up to 100 trillion to up to a quadrillion synaptic connections. At any one time, this organ is processing an infinite amount of information, both from its internal and external environment, most of which we are unconscious of. However, it is often that information, of which we are largely unaware, that has the most significant influence over our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. even those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that we adamantly believe to be consciously determined. Evidence from neuroscience tells us as it is. For example, we assume that when we are looking at something, we are consciously analyzing it based upon the visual information that is entering the brain from the eyes. But this is not entirely accurate. In fact, visual stimuli transduced by the rods and cones in the eyes and sent by electrochemical signals to the central nervous system via the optic nerves does not go directly to the occipital cortex, which is the primary region responsible for processing visual information. Instead, it first goes to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, another region of the brain that is a part of the limbic system and important to emotional arousal. To put this in simpler terms, this means that you can experience an emotional reaction to something before you are consciously aware that you have even seen it, which in turn then affects how you see it. Perhaps one of the most elegant examples is the discovery of what is commonly known by neuroscientists as mirror neurons. A mirror neuron is a neuron that fires in the brain both when an organism performs an action itself, such as reaching or grasping for an object, and it also fires when that organism observes the same action performed by another organism. Research by psychologists in this area also suggests that this may be one mechanism by which people come to internalize not only the behaviors of others, but their emotions and ideas as well. Since this is a relatively new area of research, I will instead focus on some of the more established social psychological mechanisms that may later be shown by neuroscientists to have a very biologically based origin. So to give you a brief overview, first I will present a framework for discussing psychological resistance that emphasizes the difference between a direct and an indirect approach to discussing evidence of state crimes against democracy, and that also recognizes the important role that the information environment and motivated reasoning plays in such discussions. Second, I will review one of the most important psychological foundations of democracy, which is political tolerance, and its corollary, political aggression. Third, I will give some examples of psychological constructs that can interfere with people's examination of evidence of state crimes against democracy, such as cognitive dissonance, threatened self-esteem, and perceived threats to oneself or one's worldviews. Fourth, I will talk about the problems inherent in challenging people's assumptions about government, dissent, public discourse, specifically in discussing the evidence of SCAD, such as 9/11. Here I will explain how people's defensiveness interferes with the public debate that is crucial for the survival of democracy. And finally, I will discuss the implications of research in psychology for social truth and justice movements and reform initiatives using the events of 9/11 as a primary example. And I will try to do this all in 40 minutes. A female psychologist with too much to say. What's the surprise in that? Okay, so the framework. Alternative explanations of political assassinations, terrorist attacks, and other national tragedies that differ from official state accounts are sometimes dismissed by the general public because they evoke strong cognitive dissonance, a psychological phenomenon which occurs when new ideas or information conflict with previously formed ideologies and accepted beliefs. One approach to dealing with cognitive dissonance is to directly challenge the false belief itself. For example, by presenting evidence that the belief is factually incorrect. This is what most of the presentations at these hearings have done so far, and rightly so and appropriately so. Thus, what I'm going to present on now, and even demonstrate, is the other method, the indirect approach. Now, the indirect approach, rather than challenging false beliefs directly, instead first points out the potential for the creation and persistence of false beliefs in general. This entails first demonstrating mechanisms by which beliefs can be manipulated, and then subsequently exploring what specific beliefs may have been generated falsely. Thus, before I challenge any false beliefs that may be held about the events of 9/11, I will first explain in detail how people can come to hold false beliefs in general. I expect that after I walk you through this, you will be better able to understand why the direct approach, just merely presenting evidence that the false belief is factually incorrect, not often only fails to change the false belief, but sometimes serves to strengthen it. Okay? In psychology, a false belief generally refers to one that has been manipulated, often purposely and outside of the person's awareness, and sometimes in a very specific direction or misdirection. An elegant and robust example comes from the work of Solomon Asch in the 1940s and Harold Kelly in the 1950s, and later replicated by others, including Neil Widmeyer and John Loy in the late 1980s. And Widmeyer and Loy's paper is the one that I'm going to be focusing on. This experimental manipulation of beliefs is referred to as the warm-cold effect. In a classroom setting, students in Widmeyer and Loy's experiment were given different introductions to a visiting professor and later asked to describe the professor and his lecturing abilities. But before the professor appeared, half of the students were informed that he was a rather cold person, and the other half were informed that he was a rather warm person. In addition, students in both groups were also told that he was either a professor of physical education or a professor of social psychology. Okay, so we have two things. You're told either he's a warm or cold person, and then of those groups, you're also told whether he is a professor of social psychology or education. Okay. All the students experienced the exact same lecture, which was delivered in a very neutral manner. Okay? The results showed that students who were led to believe that the lecturer was a warm person not only reported that he was much more likable than students led to believe he was a cold person, they also reported that he was a more competent teacher. This is an example of a false belief because the liking or disliking and the perceptions of competency and incompetency arose from the warm or cold introduction and not from the professor's actual mannerisms or methods of teaching, which were all identical for students. Most importantly, the information regarding the professor's area of expertise, as either a professor of physical education or social psychology, had no effect on students' perceptions. And this is a footnote, particularly for Professor Jenkins. Neither the area of expertise nor the student's own gender had any interactive effects with the warm or cold manipulation itself. Now, this experimental example has real-world consequences for a functioning democracy, such as when people can be manipulated, for example, by the media, into falsely believing that they like or dislike a presidential candidate because of his or her public policy, when in fact the perception arises solely from the media's framing of the candidate merely as likable or dislikable. The issue of competency to hold the highest position of public office does not even need to factor into the equation. Indeed, the creation and persistence of false beliefs can have very serious consequences. A case in point was demonstrated by Steve Hoffman and his colleagues in their paper entitled, "There Must Be a Reason, Osama, Saddam, and Inferred Justification," which attempted to explain the strong but false belief held by many Americans that Saddam Hussein was involved in the terrorist attacks of September 11th. It also demonstrates why the direct approach often only serves to strengthen the false belief. And here's a quote from their introduction. Ronald Reagan once remarked that the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they are ignorant, but that they know so much that isn't so. His comment goes to the heart of one of the most contentious issues in democratic theory. How should democracies handle false beliefs? False beliefs present a potentially serious challenge to democratic theory and practice, as citizens with incorrect information cannot form appropriate preferences or evaluate the preferences of others. Kuklinski and colleagues have demonstrated that incorrect beliefs, and now this is distinct from a mere lack of information, a more thoroughly studied phenomenon, are widespread and underlie substantial differences in policy preferences. One explanation that Hoffman and colleagues discuss in their paper is referred to as the information environment explanation, which suggests that the false belief about Saddam Hussein and 9/11 arose primarily from the Bush administration's campaign, which was riddled with false information and innuendo that explicitly and implicitly linked Saddam with al-Qaeda. However, Hoffman and colleagues were also able to show experimentally that there is another social psychological explanation, that of inferred justification, and this is going to be an important term, which contributed to the creation and persistence of this false belief. Now, in this experiment, and I'm just going to summarize the highlights because it was a very detailed experiment. They gave participants challenge interviews wherein reliable information was given to counter their false belief. Primarily 2 newspaper articles reporting that the 9/11 Commission had not discovered any evidence linking Saddam to 9/11, and even a quote from President Bush himself denying any claims of a link between Saddam and al-Qaeda. The responses were varied and very interesting. Here are some examples of the strategies that people used to resist information that contradicted their beliefs. First, several respondents who had earlier claimed to believe that Saddam denied making this claim in the first place, even though it was recorded on the initial survey. In one case, a participant begins by saying that he did believe that Iraq was involved in 9/11 attacks, but then corrects his statement claiming that he knew it was Afghanistan all along. In fact, when the interviewer actually shows him his prior written statement, he continues to deny believing what he answered, even though it was clearly laid out before his eyes. Now, remember that example I told you about how information is taken in through your eyes and it goes through the limbic system first, so you have an emotional reaction and arousal that affects what you see. Okay? These are some of the strategies that Hoffman and his colleagues highlight in their paper. And these are strategies that people use to resist persuasion, and these are all well known in psychology. So obviously denial, claiming that one did not actually believe what one previously claimed. Counter-arguing, directly rebutting the information. So for example, some respondents could not provide any evidence to support their belief, surprise, surprise, so they fabricated a reason. These people claimed that Saddam had to have been involved because of his hostility towards the US and his support for terrorism. To quote one of the respondents directly, "I believe he was definitely involved with it because he was definitely pumping money into the terrorist organizations every way he could. And he would even send $25,000 to somebody who committed suicide to kill another person to their family." Like how exactly did they know that? Another one was attitude bolstering, bringing facts that support one's position to mind without directly refuting the contradictory information. This was the most used strategy, wherein people would often just change the topic or start talking about other good reasons why the US was justified in going to war with Iraq. For example, some people responded that President Bush should not be judged so harshly for having acted on faulty information. Quote, "Well, I think he used the information that he had at the time. If that information was faulty, I can't see how it would be his fault." Selective exposure, ignoring the information without rebutting it or supporting it with other positions. In fact, many people simply refuse to continue to engage in the discussion with contradictory information. Quote, "I'm going to pass on this one for now." Disputing rationality, arguing that opinions do not need to be grounded in facts or reasoning. The researcher's example of how this strategy was used by one person is very telling. Interviewer, "The September 11th Commission found no link between Saddam and 9/11, and this is what President Bush said." This is what the Commission said. Do you have any comments on either of these? Respondent, "Well, I bet they say that the Commission didn't have proof of it, but I guess we can still have our opinions and feel that way even though that is what they say." And finally, inferred justification, a strategy that infers evidence which would support the respondent's beliefs. Now, this last one is very interesting. Basically, respondents retrospectively invented the causal links necessary to justify a favored politician's actions. Quote, "Inferred justification operates as a backward chain of reasoning that justifies the favored opinion by assuming the causal evidence that would support it. Now, does this sound at least vaguely familiar to anyone, particularly after hearing yesterday's testimony on the supposedly scientific methods used to determine that fires brought down the World Trade Centers? Perhaps this should be NIST's new logo. Lest you think that these kinds of reactions are just responses in a laboratory setting, I have a personal story to share with you that I hope will trouble you as much as it did me. It occurred during a friendly and casual conversation with a gentleman I had just met who was a lifelong resident of Florida. We talked about the weather first, then our careers, and then about our families and our concerns for the future, and then finally, politics and the future of America. Well, I'll tell you what I think really needs to happen to set this country straight, he said. And since this gentleman had so far given wonderful advice on how to stay married for over 40 years while raising a family, how to build a successful career, and how to be an upstanding member of one's community, and how he'd even fought in the Vietnam War, I listened pretty carefully. This is what he said. What this country needs is for some of those Al-Qaeda terrorists that attacked us on 9/11 to walk into an American household, put a gun to the head of the father of the house, line up that man's wife and children against a wall, and make him watch while they shoot everyone in his family. Then, he said, raising his voice just a little, the people in this country will understand what we are fighting to protect over there. This is a true story. After struggling to maintain my composure, I turned to ask him if he would volunteer his family for this in order to save his country. I'm a psychologist, remember. I did not ask him this directly. Instead, I gently asked him if this is not how a family in the Middle East might similarly see some American soldiers. He appeared to be honestly surprised by such a scenario, one in which the tables had been turned and the Americans were viewed as the terrorists. Now, this below is a famous photograph taken mere moments after Samar Hassan, a 5-year-old Iraqi girl, covered in the blood of her family, had just witnessed her mother and father being shot and killed by American soldiers who opened fire on her family's car as they were on their way to take her sick brother to the hospital. Now, I really did understand the point he was trying to make, perhaps more than he did, and the point is this: that unless it happens to them in their own backyards and perhaps even in their own homes, many people won't take action against what they believe is wrong with their country. Yet perhaps the point that he didn't realize that he was also making, one which is more revealing, is that unless whatever is happening to an American, it just isn't important or wrong. And it is this widespread, deeply entrenched, and false belief in American exceptionalism that is a great threat to true democracy, which is democracy for all. The type of democracy that is packaged and sold to us by the government and news media is what I will refer to throughout this talk as democracy for the few. And it is meant for some, but not for all. The point of this story is to emphasize how honest, decent, hardworking, and upstanding people can come to believe that democracy and freedom from wars of aggression belongs only to them and not to citizens of the world, whether they live in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, or even Libya. And it is this type of biased belief system that permits SCADs to continue. Indeed, the use of repression and terror, including threats of censorship, suppression of information, imprisonment, and torture by leaders to silence political opponents and dissidents, is not exclusive to authoritarian states. Such tactics can also be employed by leaders of democratic states, a fact that can be difficult for people to acknowledge, especially if it is not consistent with their belief system. A human rights Watch World Report repudiated many leaders and governments worldwide as despots, masquerading as Democrats. The report described how leaders use rhetoric, fear-mongering, and suppression of a free press to undermine the rule of law. Charges that are relevant to the current state of democracy in North America. And I'll quote from the report here. Quote, "Few governments want to be seen as undemocratic. Determined not to let mere facts stand in the way, these rulers have mastered the art of democratic rhetoric that bears little relationship to their practice of governing. The challenge they face is to appear to embrace democratic principles while avoiding any risk of succumbing to popular preferences. Electoral fraud, political violence, press censorship, repression of civil society, and even military rule have all been used to curtail the prospect of the proclaimed process of democratization might actually lead to a popular say in government. Because of these other interests, energy, commerce, counterterrorism, the world's more established democracies too often find it convenient to appear credulous of these sham democrats. Foremost has been the United States under President George W. Bush. In a troubling parallel to abusive governments around the world, the US government has embraced democracy promotion as a softer and fuzzier alternative to defending human rights. Talk of human rights leads to Guantanamo, secret CIA prisons, waterboarding, rendition, military commissions, and the suspension of a habeas corpus. To make matters worse, the Bush administration's efforts to rationalize the invasion of Iraq in terms of democracy promotion has made it easier for autocrats to equate pressure on them to democratize with an imperial militarist agenda, end quote. We must be ever vigilant of the motives of leaders who would persuade us to surrender our property, liberty, and humanity, one priceless piece at a time. How can we do this? First and foremost, by educating ourselves and our fellow citizens on how we, the people, can be manipulated by our government and its lapdog news media into forfeiting our civil liberties and duties. We need to challenge the long-standing and often erroneous assumptions about the role of government, public discourse, and dissent in democratic societies. And we can start by identifying some of the social psychological factors that can prevent people from examining evidence of crimes committed by the state. Now, one of the most important social psychological foundations of democracy is political tolerance. Democracy requires tolerance of different political views. And apparently it requires quite a lot of it if you've ever watched Fox and Friends. Democracy specifically requires tolerance of alternative political views, especially those that may be unpopular, such as public discourse on threats posed by the state towards its citizens. A person's level of political tolerance largely determines his or her support for civil liberties and his or her degree of participation in civic duties such as voting, showing support for free speech, or protesting government restrictions on freedom. Research on political tolerance shows it is strongly influenced by 1, an individual's level of commitment to democratic values, 2, individual and collective personalities, and 3, the degree of threat perception of others towards oneself. Although people with more political knowledge and experience tend to be more tolerant of dissimilar views, perceptions of threat can greatly decrease political tolerance in general. So when I'm talking about threat, it can be any kind of threat. So a threat to your belief, a threat to your self-esteem, a threat like I know more than you, just something like that challenges your belief. And failure to internalize important principles of democracy, such as political tolerance, majority rule, protection of minority rights, free speech, and equal voting, leads to apathy and double standards, or, as I've said before, democracy for the few. In addition to the information environment, such as media and culture, which can greatly influence political tolerance. So, for example, if the mainstream media portrays a group, here, if a group is portrayed as behaving properly and in an orderly fashion, then far more people, often a majority, will tolerate the group and its activities, even if the group is generally unpopular or has a different image. Research has shown that people who have a predisposition to be easily threatened, such as people with a right-wing authoritarian personality, are less tolerant than individuals who are more calm and more easily reassured. Now, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about another experiment that Falomir and Picaster and colleagues tested this theory that when an aggressive act is committed, It is the perception of the perpetrator's political association as either democratic or authoritarian that determines whether the action is perceived as legitimate or not. So the results were pretty telling. When people who, I'm just going to give you the summary because again, it was another detailed experiment. Just the main conclusion is that when people who commit aggressive acts are viewed as democratic and their victims are viewed as authoritarian, the aggression is perceived as legitimate. However, any aggression committed against a democratic group was always perceived as highly illegitimate, whether the aggressor was seen as authoritarian or instead also democratic. Hence, the less socially valued the group, the more legitimate any transgression against it was viewed, even when the aggressive acts consisted of deadly force. And I'm just going to quote their summary because it's quite important. Quote, "In recent years, democratic nations have initiated a number of armed conflicts and wars, albeit not against other democratic nations, but against non-democratic states. How can these aggressive state behaviors be justified without giving up the democratic principles of peace and rationality? We suspect that political leaders take advantage of democracy's good reputation. The results of the present studies provide potentially important insights for understanding how real intergroup and international conflicts are framed by elites to maximize their legitimacy and attract the necessary popular support. Many past and recent military interventions have been justified by portraying them as an opposition between good democratic forces and evil non-democratic forces. Unfortunately, such a claim has a high price because it implies that democratic lives count more than non-democratic lives. We hope that the present research can contribute to a better understanding of the dynamics underlying not only public support for, but also widespread opposition to Western democratic aggressions against non-democratic targets." Okay. Psychological barriers to state crimes against democracy. Although people may harbor some cynicism, so I was going to pull this up. Although people may harbor some cynicism about, actually, just wait a second. Although some people may harbor cynicism about bureaucrats and politicians, most do not want to believe that public officials in general, and especially those at the highest office, would participate in election tampering, assassinations, mass murder, or other high crimes, especially in democratic societies. Now, this is taken from another study. For example, although public cynicism towards government was high in the months prior to 9/11, for example, fewer than 30% of U.S. citizens indicated that they trusted their government to do what is right, trust in U.S. officials in Washington rose significantly. It more than doubled to 64% in the weeks following the terrorist attacks, suggesting that heightened focus on national security breeds support for incumbent foreign policymakers. Claims that state intelligence and other officials within democratic states could conspire with criminal elements to kill innocent civilians are difficult for citizens of those states to comprehend, even when backed by substantial evidence. Evidence that U.S. officials have used the attacks of 9/11 as a means to manipulate the mass public into accepting two major wars of aggression has been dangerously ignored by mainstream media and academia until recently. And I'm going to quote here from McDermott and Philip Zimbardo. An alternative hypothesis for the current system that bears examination suggests that leaders strive to manipulate public opinion through the strategic use of fear and anger in order to gain political power and advantage. If leaders want or need backing for a particular campaign that is likely to be unpopular or expensive in lives and material, such as war or restrictions on civil liberties, then the effective use of anger, threat, and fear can work to enhance public support. In this way, a terrorism alarm can simultaneously serve as both a political and a strategic tool, end quote. So to expose and prosecute officials responsible for orchestrating scads, people must first be presented with information of such crimes within the public sphere, and second, must be able to objectively consider evidence for supporting those allegations, even facts that challenge their pre-existing beliefs about democratic governments and citizen trust in leaders. As one of the United States' most prominent criminal prosecutors explains in his recent book, The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder, quote, You have to disabuse yourself of any preconceived notion you have that just because George Bush is the president of the United States, he is simply incapable of engaging in conduct that smacks of great criminality. Because if you take that position, a position that has no foundation in logic, you're not going to be receptive to the evidence. End quote. Thus, protecting democracy demands that citizens must be made aware of how they can be manipulated by government and media into forfeiting their civic liberties and duties. Information vital to protecting citizens from crimes against democracy orchestrated by the state, as history has repeatedly demonstrated, can happen particularly in times of disaster, collective shock, and national threat. And at this point, I want to point out that we have one very courageous individual here with us today that did not forfeit his civic duties when the time came to act and attempted to arrest George Bush in Canada for being the war criminal that he is splitting the sky here in the room right now. Can you please stand? And accept my deepest gratitude for your honor and integrity, sir. Okay. I'm noticing that I have quite a bit more information, and much of it is quite technical. And I think what I'm going to do, because I know that there were a lot of questions about this topic, and I'm not too worried because of getting through all of it, because anybody who wants a copy of my paper can just email me and I will send you a copy of it. I think instead, at this point, when I have just a few minutes left, I'd like to make a couple important remarks and then move on to questions, if that's all right. Because I think I've covered quite a bit for now and said some of the more important things. So just a couple of remarks. Okay. This will take me I'll keep it under 5 minutes. Okay. So I would like to comment on what we have done here these past 4 days, which many of you may be unaware has been a painstaking year in the making. The steering committee, and I would please ask them to stand for this moment, consisting of Kevin Ryan, James Gourley, Okay, two more. Graham McQueen and Adnan Zuberi. And myself. The steering committee had a visionary purpose for this event. We sought to create an event for the 10th anniversary of 9/11 that would force the mainstream media to cover it with seriousness and gravity for a change, and report the fact that we have gathered before us an international panel of distinguished persons, including a judge and 3 professors and thousands of viewers, to hear expert testimony from established academics, researchers, and experts that the official account of the events of September 11th, 2001, as reported by the 9/11 Commission Report and the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the Global War on Terror, is a fraud perpetrated on all citizens of the world. And we have done it.
What articles were you holding up, please?
Okay, the first one, and this is very interesting, Dr. Jenkins, thank you, is in the Globe and Mail. And the Globe and Mail did an interview with Graham McQueen, and it was actually a very fair piece. And it was the first newspaper to report that the panel includes the honorary president of the Supreme Court of Italy. Thank you, Globe and Mail. The second one forced the National Post to print this fair and balanced article. And it is a very good article. It is not a hit piece. It just clearly explains the expert testimony that was presented on the first day by Kevin Ryan, Lance DeHaven Smith, and Professor Griffin. And please note that the author of Life Amongst the Truthers, Jonathan Kay, is also one of the editors of the National Post. I think he probably slept in that morning. Now, these articles are clear evidence that the principles of psychology that I have just been discussing do indeed work. It took one reputable, mainstream Canadian newspaper to report the details of our event that compelled others to follow suit. And we designed this event specifically to do that. We took care to make it dignified and have it proceed in a specific manner, to have a distinguished panel that will produce a final report. And it was this framing of our evidence that compelled them to finally have to report on it seriously. Now, although this is quite an historic change, it is a very shameful mark on our history as Canadians that we must go to such lengths to force our fourth estate, the press, whose primary duty it is to accurately report on the state of affairs to citizens so that they can make the most informed decisions and meet their civic responsibilities in a democratic state. Perhaps we should remind them that journalists have, in the past, been tried and convicted and punished for failing to do their job. And many more will be so prosecuted in the future for failing to expose these state crimes against democracy, which is a high crime in and of itself. At this time, I would also like to make a few other brief comments. First, in response to Jonathan Kay's sexist and erroneous assertion that women are not intelligent enough to wrestle with these deep puzzles of conspiracy, Cynthia McKinney, Barbara Honegger, and myself are right here, and we appear to be much better wrestlers with this material than Mr. Kay. In fact, I extend an invitation to Mr. Kay to wrestle with me on these issues. In all fairness, I should probably tell Mr. Kay that I also hold a black belt in Kung Fu. Okay? It's true. Second, for some of the men that you see here today, there are women who have supported them. I am reminded of Christina Maslach. I don't know if any of you know her. She was a graduate student and partner of one of the most well-known psychologists in the United States, Dr. Philip Zimbardo, who conducted the Stanford prison experiment in the 1970s. And it was Christina who compelled him to end the experiment early because he himself had become too absorbed in his role as the warden and had lost his scientific and ethical objectivity. Okay. So in conclusion, I've tried to present first a brief overview of the social psychological foundations of democracy and research suggesting how pre-existing beliefs can interfere with SCAD inquiry, specifically in relation to September 11th. And I want to end with one important quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, who I opened up with, that is just imperative today and perhaps even more so than when he said it. And I'm going to quote him now. "We must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace in Vietnam and justice throughout the developing world, a world that borders on our doors. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter, but beautiful, struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the sons of God, and our brothers wait eagerly for our response. Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell them the struggle is too hard? Will our message be that the forces of American life militate against their arrival as full men, and we send our deepest regrets? Or will there be another message of longing, of hope, of solidarity with their yearnings, of commitment to their cause, whatever the cost? The choice is ours, and though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of human history." Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie Manwell. Professor Jenkins.
Laurie, soon to be Dr. Manwell, your thoughts have provoked some complicated thoughts of my own. So I hope you'll be patient with me as I try to make them clear. The social psychological, what shall I say, cognitive processes that you have so ably summarized, processes that keep us from being the perfect, rational, objective truth seekers and lead us to take many shortcuts and distort our efforts to find the truth, I think you would accept are really universal fallibilities in the human condition. They're not fallibilities possessed only by one group. So if I were forced to write a paper, excuse me, entitled Psychological Resistance to Accepting the Official Account, I would use many of the mechanisms that you propose. I would talk about confirmation bias. I would talk about cognitive dissonance and the way it can lead to distortions of rational conclusions. I would certainly want to talk about, had I known it before, about the limbic system on the way to the visual cortex, because surely we all possess that. So we are all subject to believing is seeing as well as seeing is believing. So my complicated thought is, I don't want to suggest by this claim that we all suffer the same shortcomings, that we all proceed to seek the truth in the same way. But then it leads me to the question, how is it that we seek the truth differently, since we are all victims of this human condition, this fallibility? And I'm inclined to say that it's because while we cannot exempt ourselves from these processes, we can, if we become aware of them, try to protect ourselves, and the best way to protect ourselves is through an appreciation and use of scientific method. I don't think there's any other way to protect ourselves from these corruptions, if you will, of a rational, reasoned process. And I offer to you the thought that when we do better as seekers of the truth than some others, we do it because we pay more respect to the scientific method, not because our minds work differently.
I couldn't say it better. I absolutely agree with you. And I think that that is the exact mechanism by which we protect ourselves from these biases, is being more aware of when we are susceptible to them. And even myself, I know that I'm susceptible to them every single moment of every day. I mean, the brain works much like a kaleidoscope. It's never the same in any 1 second ever. You are constantly taking in information visually, auditorily, through smell and touch. And that information is all coming in at the same time, plus you are having thoughts and feelings, and you're moving around doing things, and these other cues in your environment are influencing what you think outside of your conscious awareness. So for example, because of the way the brain develops and the neural connections develops, that cues in the environment that you are not aware of can bring up memories and emotions from things that have nothing to do with the subject that you're talking about. So for example, we're standing here talking about 9/11, and somebody wearing a blue shirt or somebody with a certain perfume that reminds you of your mother will bring up a memory or an emotion that will then influence what you are thinking about on the topic 9/11 that has nothing to do with 9/11 whatsoever. And then how do you know if that emotion you're having is about the subject or perhaps is coming from somewhere else that you're not aware of? And the way to do that is just to constantly ask yourself, is there another reason for me having this opinion? Is there any other reason? And this is so crucial why we wanted to have a panel. It's because we didn't want to just have people come up here and report what they believe, even though they have used the scientific method and critical, rational, evidence-based analysis to come to conclusions. We wanted those conclusions to be challenged. We wanted the people presenting the evidence to challenge themselves ahead of time to produce the best report they could, and then we wanted you to challenge them too. And you did. You hit the nail on the head with the questions that you have been asking throughout these 4 days.
I thought at one time in your talk, when you were referring to deference to authority, and the way we evaluate the substance of a message distorted by our deference to authority was something that did apply more to those who accept the official story than to those who would tend to reject it. And here, I guess I beg to differ, because I think we are all subject to deference to authority, but we pick our authorities differently. But within this group, we defer to authority, and we have to, because cognitive economy requires it. We just can't get through this blooming, buzzing world of information without making some prior judgments about to whom we are going to listen carefully. And I think we all do that. In fact, I'm sure you know, as we all do, that we spend a lot of time rehearsing the credentials of experts. And we do it because we think it'll get us a little deference to authority in some form. I don't think we do it to decorticate people, but we say, you ought to pay attention. This person has something important to say. And so we, like everybody else, defer to authority, but our authorities are different. And maybe I hope that the kind of authorities we defer to are more authentic, have more reason to be deferred to than the kinds of authorities that many people who oppose our views are likely to defer to.
Thank you, Professor Jenkins. Professor Lee.
I'd like to jump into this elevated, almost philosophical discussion by demurring. First of all, I acknowledge that what you've been referring to are psychological mechanisms that are universal, that affect us all. But I'd like to remind us that what varies in this is the degree of malevolence of which the dominant power possesses, and the degree to which the dominant power's agenda departs from general human welfare and the common good. So let me enlarge on that.
Yeah.
So we all bring our critical faculties to bear on the world. We can be fooled. We can be fooled once, twice, 3 times. But what is unprecedented, I think, is the degree of malevolence of the forces that are arrayed against common sense and the common good in today's world. And so that's what I'd like to focus on. I was thinking about my childhood in Canada with Lester B. Pearson and even John Diefenbaker, and it was a much simpler time. There just wasn't the sheer degree of malevolence, evidence of which have been uncovered in our hearings, the sheer degree of malevolence that is being directed actively by a wide array of forces against people arriving at reasonable decisions. Isn't that what state crimes against democracy is all about? So I want to sort of relieve us from thinking, well, we're all this or we're all that. My second thought is you've very effectively gone over the literature, which is absolutely fascinating, about the study of situations where people can hold on to erroneous views with great conviction and use all kinds of adaptive devices, psychological mechanisms, defense mechanisms for denying, oh, I didn't say that, or even if what you say is true, I still believe my view. So all that can also be somewhat depressing if you sort of say, well, this is what we're up against. On the other hand, we know that throughout history there have been dramatic transformations of consciousness, much of which was achieved with difficulty, sometimes great difficulty, going from the Ptolemaic view of the position of the sun in the solar system to the Copernican and Galilean view, for example, the acceptance of biological evolution, for example. And so I'm wondering if we could make a project out of studying how these psychological transformations are accomplished, because it's a psychological transformation of that magnitude is the only way we're going to get this material into the public space that it needs to be in.
Can I just make a brief comment? I agree with you absolutely. And something that occurs to me often is Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, wherein he was trying to do some experimental studies to help explain some of the behavior of the Nazis and how some people were thought to compartmentalize certain evil actions and then go home to a family and be a regular family person. I mean, you can't make those kinds of assertions from his experiment. They're not, really transferable. But so the one thing that I find so interesting about his experiments is that even though, say, like 75% of the people just easily deferred to authority, there was that one quarter that didn't. And that it's that one quarter, those type of people that we really need to study. We need to start studying the people who don't defer to authority, that are more easily to say, no, not just because you said so. Those are the people. And I just wanted to make just one more comment related to that, is that a member of my family, an elderly member of my family who lived through the Blitzkrieg in England, is much more open to hearing this because she knows the evil that exists in the world than other members of my family who have not lived through that. And I think that's sort of an important point to make.
Yes, Professor Johnson.
Thank you for a very stimulating presentation. The tools of psychology can cut in both directions. And we know that the military has long had employed psychologists to act on their side of this equation. I wonder if you would care to comment on how we identify the misuse, let us call it, of psychology for malevolent purposes and what we can do to defend against it.
That's an excellent question, because they're out there. And in my paper, I do talk a little bit more about a couple different theories. One is terror management theory, and it's based on the work of some graduate students over 30 years ago, Solomon Pazinski and Greenberg, and they took Ernest Becker's idea of the denial of death, and that people are so dependent upon their worldviews that they will just fight to the death to defend them, both psychologically and physically, and that there are psychologists that know this and they use these mechanisms, and I really focus on that one in response to 9/11, the terror management theory and this terror alert. Like, the psychologists know all this is going on, and there are psychologists that are using it. One book I would point to would be Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, where she goes into extreme detail of how it's done. But I would assume that it's out there and being used all the time.
Thank you. We're a bit over time. Are we good, gentlemen? Okay. Thank you, Laurie Manwell.
Okay. Thank you.